Hi, I'm Hazel Dukes, and you are watching the 85th Annual New York State Convention.
We at the NAACP are always working toward equality, whether it's fighting for election reform, advocating for voting rights, or working towards fair districts. Here to explore these topics is my friend Eljoy Williams, president of the Brooklyn NAACP, with our election reform and redistricting workshop. Hey, Eljoy.
Thanks, Tracy, and welcome Game Changers to the Elections Reform and Redistricting Workshop. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to dive right in, beginning with elections reform. We are all engaged in advocacy across the country, particularly our national office on elections reform and voting rights. And here in New York, we know there is a lot of work to do. Joining us for a conversation on the reforms needed here in the state of New York is Senator Zelnor Myrie, who represents the 20th Senatorial District in Brooklyn, all right, Brooklyn, and is chair of the Elections Committee. Senator Myrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So let's start from the beginning as to the reason why the committee just recently had a number of hearings across the state regarding elections reform.
Well, Eldra, we know that democracy is the infrastructure in which the rest of our society is built, but the guardians of that infrastructure are our local boards of elections. They're the ones that have to administer the elections. They're the people that you interact with when you go to the polls. And unfortunately, in New York, we've had story after story after story about failures at the Board of Elections. Now, why is that important? We're at a time in our country where the integrity of our democracy is in question. We have legislatures all across the United States passing anti-voting measures. So here in New York, we can't be the source of a national embarrassment. Our boards of elections need to meet the moment. So we decided to go all across the state. We went to Albany, we went to Westchester, Rochester, Syracuse, and of course the County of Kings to hear from voters directly about how we need to fix our boards of elections.
Yeah, so when we are talking about voting rights in general, quite often things are focused on like Texas and Georgia and places where there is, very overt actions taking place, policies and laws being put in place that restrict voting rights or can have a negative effect on people's right to vote. Here in the state of New York, it's more about the actual administration of how our elections are administered. But we're also talking to a number of branches all across the state. They're NAACP members, but they also may be election, they work for the Board of Elections or they're helping to administer elections. And I'm sure you heard from a lot of NAACP members across the state about some of those problems. They're not as sexy as, some racist person trying to prevent you from registering or voting. So talk a bit about what are some of the problems that the committee heard during the hearings.
I think it's an important point that you bring up, that we got a lot of members working in our boards of elections that come to work every day in good faith. They want to do the right thing. They want to execute the elections in a fair and equitable way, but they're hindered by some of the structures. And that's a lot of what we heard throughout the state. People say that the bipartisan nature and construction of the boards leads to stalemates. Others said that simple things like moving a poll site to a place where there aren't black people, as we have seen across the state, that is a form of voter suppression that doesn't make the news, that isn't as sexy as you mentioned, but is just as oppressive when you have seniors who are used to going to the same polling site for years and years and years, having that moved without enough notice. We heard from individuals who took pride in being a poll worker. One gentleman said, I have a son that has served in the Marines, and while I am not able to serve in that capacity, I feel like when I'm a poll worker, I'm serving my country. We had other folks who said, I have bad arthritis in both of my knees, and there's nothing that you can do to stop me from waiting online to get to the polls. But that person shouldn't have to wait online to get to the polls. They shouldn't have to wait for an inordinate amount of time. We heard a lot of complaints about the lines. We heard a lot of complaints about accessibility for the disabled. We heard a lot of complaints about language access as well. And so we have a real job to do here in the state of New York. I like to say that my job as the elections chair is to take New York from worst to first. Right now, we're about in the middle of the pack. And so I'm hoping that we can continue to do that with a bunch of the reforms that we're thinking about and that we've already made.
Well, let's jump to that. What are some of the reforms that should be included in, probably already included in our legislative advocacy, but talk about some of the reforms. I know same-day voter registration. I know also talking about the partisanship piece that you're mentioning, allowing more people to actually participate in being poll workers. But talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so you mentioned one that I think is important to remind folks. We have two big constitutional amendments on the ballot this November. One is same-day registration. If you have ever shopped for a turkey the day before Thanksgiving or gone shopping for Christmas the day before Christmas, you know that we wait to the last minute to do things. And for voter registration, you shouldn't be hindered by an arbitrary deadline. The same-day registration constitutional amendment would allow for people to register on the day of election. Hopefully that will pass. The second one is no excuse absentee voting. Now, we saw during the pandemic, we got very accustomed to voting by absentee. In fact, in parts of the state, the usage of absentee ballots went up 600%. This is something that's here to stay. New Yorkers are used to it. The law right now requires you to check a box to say, here's my excuse for why I need an absentee ballot. No excuse would say, if you want one, you get one. So those two things are on the ballot, really important. Some of the structural things, there's a lot of talk about the professionalization of our boards. People say they should look more like a civil service apparatus where you have to sort of prove that you are able to carry out these elections. I think there are pros and cons to that. There is talk about another constitutional amendment. Right now, our Constitution requires that the Democrats and Republicans have equal representation on our boards and in our staffs. But what happens to all of the people who are unaffiliated, people who are independent? That's a question that we're going to be grappling with. And then there's some minor changes and some minor tweaks to the administration that I think would go a long way. How we appoint our election commissioners, how much we pay our election commissioners, what we do to recruit poll workers. So not super duper sexy stuff. But it is the building blocks of our democracy, and it's incumbent on us to really tackle it.
Yeah. I want to go back really quickly to the professionalization, because I think that's something that it is and should be a concern for NAACP, because with that can sometimes come, as you made it nice and said, cons. I'm going to be over and say it's a way to push out Black and brown people who have been historically engaged in this work. As you said from the top, there are people that take pride in being poll workers, take pride in working at the Board of Elections, no matter how they came to that job, right? Whether it was a district leader who appointed them or something like that. But it is a way for people to get a job that, couldn't, or because of not having certain degrees or things of that nature, they'll be able to actually, make a living and care for their families and take pride in their work. I have a concern, and I think it's, a very valid concern that NAACP has, in the word professionalism could come with a number of requirements that would then X out a number of people of color.
This is a really excellent point, and I think built into the phrase professionalization is a suggestion that people who do it now aren't professionals.
Yeah.
Right? And we know that there are a lot of professional people working at these boards. I get the spirit of that principle in that we want the best of the best administering our elections. I don't think anyone is going to argue about that. But unfortunately, we have seen this play out in some other spaces where, as you said, Eljoy, we eliminate people that look like you and me under the guise of professionalization. So I think there's a way for us to find a balance. You want the best people working at the polls. We have to recognize that a major swath of the workers are temporary. If you're a poll worker, you're not working at the Board of Elections year round.
Yeah.
And so there is a question of how you manage a temporary workforce for something that is so important. I think there are ways for us to find the balance, but to center people having opportunities to serve if they want to serve, even if they don't have the credentials that you might expect in some other space.
And particularly when the, quote, credentials are far and few between, right? Like, it's not like, you know, you go to school. Yes, there are some people that go to school like for this or whatever, who should be commissioners and things of that nature. But then there are, you know, other trainings and things that would allow you to continue that work, that we have to make sure that we provide an avenue for people to participate in, and not going to like Wisconsin, you know, to do a training or get a certification in order to participate. So, you know, I want to close really quickly talking about some of the things that have been on our agenda for some time, mainly the Voting Rights Act, you know, here in the state of New York, and some other things that are on your committee's horizon for the upcoming legislative year.
So we have, unfortunately, a conversation in this country that is going in the wrong direction. Since 2013, the Supreme Court eviscerated our Federal Voting Rights Act, and so the protection that had for voters that look like you and I has been completely obliterated on the federal level. And here in the state of New York, I've introduced the John R. Lewis New York Voting Rights Act that would allow for us to institute some of these protections right here in the state. And it matters because we have voter suppression. It's not just a New York City problem, it's a statewide problem. And we need to enshrine these protections in our laws so that these boards of elections that sometimes institute policies that disproportionately affect Black and brown people, that they be held accountable and that there be a mechanism to stop them if that's the case. So I'm very proud to sponsor that legislation. I'm very proud to work hand in hand with you and NAACP. I think we have an opportunity to get this passed next session, so I'm looking forward to coming back and saying we did it.
All right. Well, thanks so very much, Senator Mari, for joining us. We turn our attention now to redistricting. Recently, the Independent Redistricting Commission released multiple versions of new maps for the state, but we shouldn't spend too much time fighting over those, whether they're letters, numbers, or what have you, because I can tell you right now, neither version is going to pass the legislature. Instead, our branches should be focused on organizing and advocating for fair districts that could keep our communities whole all across the state. So joining us to give you a redistricting crash course is Dr. Zalima Blair, the Redistricting Research Director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College and chair of the, award-winning, I should say, Department of Public Administration. Thank you, Dr. Blair, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm going to start first. What are you guys like the top 10 public administration
in the 8 in the country.
Absolutely. Just got to celebrate that. Brooklyn,
That's right.
Anyway. But I want to start with redistricting crash course. Okay. What is redistricting? Mm-hmm. For a number of people, they be new to NAACP, new to redistricting in general, mm-hmm. and sort of just need a baseline of what we are supposed to be doing.
Yes, I like to say redistricting is like the varsity of the civic engagement courses, right? It is up there, and it is the constitutionally mandated, right? So we're required to do it. Redrawing of legislative lines at the federal, state, and local level. So every 10 years after the census is released, the decennial census, we redraw political boundaries to make sure that populations are equal so that one set of population does not receive more representation than the other.
Yeah, so that's the basics, mm-hmm. but here in the state of New York, we have a new process mm-hmm. as to how we're doing redistricting that came out of an election. Okay. Why elections are important, why it's important to turn over your ballot and read the other things that are on there. Right. But we now have this redistricting commission mm-hmm. in addition to the general process of going through the legislature. Talk a bit about that.
All over the country, good government groups started this process that they wanted the redistricting process or redrawing of legislative maps to be independent of political pressure. That's hard to do because it's actually the legislatures who actually choose these individuals, and redistricting maps are legislative documents, so it has to be passed through the legislature. The object or the objective was for more community input, was for more groups to get involved, was to have everything being done by residents of those districts and to have real community input. Unfortunately, the redistricting process here in New York state started out with a lawsuit. And so it was more politicized than everything else because it was supposed to be funded. It wasn't funded. They weren't able to hire the people. And the community still doesn't have the tools or public spaces to really provide the input that they need or to comment on these particular maps. It took a long time for them to get the software. It took a long time for the census results to be released. And if it were not for centers and groups like Center for Law and Social Justice, the community wouldn't even have an understanding of what they should be commenting on. So that's a problem. And there are stepping stones to this redistricting process. One, after the commission is formed, they're supposed to inform the community about the hearings, what they want to see in these particular maps. Groups are supposed to be educated on where your boundaries are and what you're supposed to be commenting on. Unfortunately, a lot of groups don't know that they're even supposed to participate. Nonprofit organizations, church leaders, hospitals, all the individuals who advocate for specific social issues, they're not even sure that I'm supposed to come to these hearings, right? So that's a problem. And then, after that, when the maps are drawn, they don't even know that they're supposed to come back and comment again. How many people know that as of September 15th, political maps have been drawn, and that it takes a 30-day process for them to then come back and comment again? So most hearings begin on October 16th throughout the state of New York, but New York City and some of the outer areas outside of New York City, like Long Island, Westchester County, those will take place in November. So here's your crash course on some of those things that you need to be aware of, because this is going to impact you on whether or not most people say they don't need to go see their elected official. Chances are you might.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And depending on that, we're going to put up on screen the actual dates of the upcoming hearings so that every branch across the state knows that they should be gearing up to testify at hearings, and we'll share that information shortly. But I want to go back, because we're talking about the community actually having input in how the lawns are drawn. I want you to talk about communities of interest. So when you're thinking about your community, what's included, talk about how you are advocating for your, quote, community.
So communities of interest is a term of art. Let's put it that. Let's start there, right? It's community and it's interest. It's community in that it's in a geographic space, and the interest part of it is recognize similarities within a particular group. So what does that mean? Along ethnic lines, along religious lines, along language lines, you share interests with a group of individuals in a compact space, okay, in a particular geography. And so in my neighborhood in Crown Heights, where do we all shop? Where do all our kids go to school? So there's these social factors that you take into consideration when you consider your political boundaries, when you consider who am I, or what I'm supposed to speak about when I talk to these individuals or when I comment on these maps. Everyone knows where their neighborhood boundaries, or you're supposed to know, begin or end, right?
Or there could be lots of arguments about it, because I'm sure you can do a whole bunch of arguments on when if Classen actually is the end or the beginning of Bedford-Stuyvesant.
Some people say Bedford.
And I'm sure it's like that everywhere, which is different because in certain parts of the state, like I know here on Long Island, because I went to school and lived out here, right? You may have a pretty defined, this is Roosevelt. Roosevelt includes these, these blocks and these communities, but in different parts of the state, it may be different.
Well, this is where the conversations, nothing beats word of mouth, right? This is where you talk to people. You have the conversations in your church. You have the conversations in school. Where are the civic lessons in the schools? We had them with the decennial census. I know I went around and did them. So what about these now community conversations? We don't necessarily have to say redistricting, because that might scare people. But if you say, let's talk about some communities of interest in our schools, as part of our civic engagement lessons, this might be helpful. But from you're young, you know that whether or not you grew up in Flatbush, you know whether or not you grew up in Harlem, you knew whether or not you grew up in the Wakefield section of the Bronx. So in these particular areas that are bounded by geographic lines, you sort of know along this strip on Fulton Street, here's where we all go to get this. In Sheepshead Bay, we all go to this waterfront to eat, all our families bury in this particular neighborhood, our family members in this particular cemetery. So these are particular interests that you all share, and we don't want them cracked. And what we mean by not wanting them cracked, we don't want them separated, because when it's time to advocate for institutions that your community built historically, you don't want it taken away. You know, many times you come back to your old neighborhood as a kid and you say, do you remember when this was here? Right? Now it's not here anymore because
It belonged to, it's in somebody else's
else,
district
or
now.
they couldn't keep the funding up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
That's a problem.
So it's now represented by multiple people, either in the local legislature, be it your city council or county board. You have multiple senators, rather than having the power be centralized and being able to advocate. So here is something that our branches can do: is we can have meetings, or a portion of our meetings be just focused on communities of interest. What makes our community our community? What school or schools, plural, are in our communities? What boundaries do we say? And looking at your existing boundaries and being able to say, you know, this line, Senate line actually splits our community, right? And we want to make sure that our community is whole from there. Let's switch really quickly to talk about some of the demographic changes that we've seen from the census numbers in terms of where people of African descent, Black folks, have moved all across the state. There have been some shifts and changes. I know there's a heavy focus on, oh, Black people left, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So I want you to talk a bit about that.
So that's the thing. Black people or people of African descent did not leave. They moved around, and people moved. That's why we take the census. They moved for social reasons, economic reasons, some even political reasons. So Black people, let's say, in New York City, the African American population grew substantially. Where we saw some decreases in the population for people of African descent, maybe in the West Indian community in some parts of the city, or in the continental African part populations. But we did see a lot of increases in East New York. We saw a big shift to the Bronx. Brooklyn, of course, maintains its population. It saw a 10% increase. The Bronx saw a 7% increase. But the Bronx experienced increases in places that it used to have a substantial population for people of African descent, but now it's coming back. The central part, West Tremont, all the central Bronx River, the South Bronx, all those areas that were not populated by people of African descent, they are now. Westchester County always had, right above the Bronx, always had a heavy confluence of West Indians or Caribbeans, and they still do. Mount Vernon, New Rochelle. New Rochelle's experiencing a number of influx of the Caribbean population for reasons that we're talking about with communities of interest, better schools, et cetera. Buffalo maintains its population. So every single area that I've been looking at for people of African descent, we saw an increase. Now, in the types of legislative districts that we're looking at, we may not notice those increase. Why? Because of how the districts were drawn 10 years ago. But if you stick to communities of interest this time around, you will see the increases. You will see the shifts. You will see that there are opportunities to create additional areas that people of African descent have been moving around in.
So lastly, I want you to talk about, I know the Unity Map coalition that's happening down in New York City, but in talking about other places across the state, you mentioned Buffalo, Westchester and other places. Rochester, Syracuse, which historically have had Black populations. What upstate, in Western New York and, Southern New York, like what should branches in those areas be looking at?
I say in particularly places like Broome County and Ithaca that has substantial populations for people of African descent. They have the least populated congressional district, for example. Here's a chance to make it a big percentage of that district and possibly elect someone of African descent there. I say that that's what the NAACP should be looking at. They only note places like Chautauqua, whatever, right? But it includes that whole western area. And so I would be looking there. I would be looking to also strengthen certain areas in Albany. I would be looking to strengthen Rockland County, Yonkers. And so those are the places I will begin concentrating on.
Well, we have a lot of work to do, Bridges. And as we mentioned, we're going to put up the schedule for the redistricting hearings. And as I said in the beginning, yes, the Independent Commission has released 2 versions of MAP. Again, going back to the partisanship, there's a Republican version and a Democratic version. But what we should be focused on is having conversations within our communities. It's an opportunity for our branches to go out into the community, bring people in via Zoom or if you're in person and vaccinated, and bring people into the conversation to talk about the community at large, what the boundaries are, what the like interests are, and then take that information and be able to testify at the upcoming hearings. Talk a bit about, we have a few more minutes, what should people include in their testimony to the commission about their community?
That's a great question. And so people should always say where they live. Of course, you introduce yourself. If you're tied to an institution, you should talk about that. You should say how long, your length of time as a resident in this community and as a part of this institution. And to get to the meat of it, you should speak about the populations that you serve and maybe why you've fallen short on expanding services to these individuals because the community was not able to come together. So for example, for years, East Flatbush and Flatbush have been split along congressional lines, and so they weren't able to pull together those participants to get the types of funding they need for these nonprofit organizations, right? Caribbean health centers and things of that nature that a big part of that district contains. So I would be speaking about the type of institution I'm tied to, the residency, the length of time, the population served, the neighborhood served, and the ethnicity of the individuals that this. All about the communities of interest and the types of services that they could receive and how it would improve the community if they were able to advocate together.
And lastly, there are some things you shouldn't say when you are testifying, because we can't go in there and just be like, we want to create a black district, right?
No. So you should never speak about race. It's all about communities of interest. You should always keep it about, anything cultural. And because, I went to school, for example, with a lot of people of Hispanic descent and a lot of Caucasians. And so we had a common interest, right? That what we wanted to do. And so the courts maintain that communities of interest transcends racial lines. And if we want to protect that, and sometimes it is about that, but most importantly, it's transcendent. And so you want to make sure that it can still be protected in the courts and that we don't go any step backwards because we've come this far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blair. So as you can see, we have a lot of work ahead of us as it pertains to elections reform and the redistricting process here in the state. But now I want to turn our attention to our resolutions process. And this is primarily for our legislative agenda for the next legislative year. If your branch will be doing a resolution of an issue that should be included in our legislative agenda, please make sure it is sent to the state office by the end of December 31st to be exact. So that means you have plenty enough time for your branch committees to actually present it to the branch members, for them to vote for it, and then for it to come to the state office. From there, the resolutions committee will be taking all of the resolutions submitted, will be discussing them, may reach back out to you for additional information before we make the decision to include it in our legislative agenda. Thank you so very much for joining us for this very important conversation, and please make sure you share it with your civic engagement committees and with the larger community.
Now, our panelists will present a live Q&A.
So Eljoy, before I turn it over to you, I just want to, on behalf of all of us, say congratulations to you for your award, the E.T. Reed Award. So well deserved. And I am just so thankful to be able to look at those beautiful eyes and thank you on behalf of our president
and all of us for all of the wonderful work that you do on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And I was so surprised. But, I have to, as many times as I've talked to Miss Dukes, she's a good secret keeper, it seems. So, and Janine and everybody else. So I'll have to, I'm getting all of you.
All right. Well,
Right.
congratulations. Then I will leave it up to you and Dr. Blair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thanks, everyone. I hope the panel that we presented was informative, gives you additional information that you can take back to your branches. Now, I saw in the chat that as Dr. Blair was talking, and she was mentioning particular cities and areas across the state, that folks were saying, well, what about Rochester? And what about this? And what about that? And so this is your opportunity now to use that chat function and ask your questions, so we can talk to Dr. Blair a little bit more about redistricting. And then I want to save 5 minutes for the end of the Q&A for us to talk about the ballot proposals that will be on November's ballot, because I know a number of you have questions about that as well. So I want to go first, Dr. Blair. Everybody has questions about their individual areas. And there is a report coming out this week that you have authored, along with some charts and information that sort of detail the shifts just in New York City of communities of African descent throughout New York City. But let's turn our attention to the other parts of the state that you were mentioning, like Western New York, Rochester, Albany, and others, on some of the changes and shifts that you've seen, just to expound upon that a little bit more.
Yes, so we've seen through the decade, with a peak in around 2014, 2015, a real increase in, I saw someone put Ulster County, yes, that whole Poughkeepsie area, Dutchess County, things that are just right above, places that are just right above New York City that people could easily commute to. And so there is a rise there. Albany, as people and individuals graduate from college in those areas, Albany and Broome County and Syracuse, they tend to stay there for a while. And so we see that some of our younger individuals, they end up having a job and relocate there. And so it's a good place to live because good cost of living, schools, et cetera, and they develop a community there, family there, et cetera. So we see that there's always an increase, and as economic development actually spurs in some of these areas that normally was not there before, and as businesses relocate there, we saw the rise of people of African descent. And we know why people move, for economic reasons and for social reasons. And so we saw an increase in people of African descent in these surrounding areas right outside of New York City. And of course, Westchester County and Long Island, Nassau County and Suffolk County, they will always see spillovers, if you will, from New York City for a number of social reasons, and we leave it there.
Yeah, so I know we're doing a lot of organizing regarding drawing our own maps down here in New York City, but I want to specifically continue the focus on other parts of the state right now outside of New York City, where the local officials or groups that are organizing and creating maps may not have the interests of people of African descent at heart in other places of the state. And so, let's talk them through, one, they should have a meeting specifically focused on their area, specifically focused on redistricting and talking about their communities and their boundaries. But what are some of the other things that they can do to advance the interests of their community?
Well, some of the things, besides for having their local meetings and their chapters, they really need to create the awareness that this is occurring at the moment. And they need to create outlets for people to participate in this process. It's not hard. It's a similar process to the census. Lots of times when people did not have access to the internet and things of that nature, they went to the library. And so the local public libraries, if you will, could be a place where free software could be used to do this kind of work, to draw circles around this is where my community of interest is, and I would appreciate it if this would be kept whole. So on the individual level or on a group level, I'm talking about two different aspects, individual and group level, this could be done in the community, in community institutions. And more so to connect to the institutional level with the Independent Redistricting Commission, it is important that that information, when gathered, is then taken and presented at one of the hearings that will begin shortly. The more people that are saying the same things in these hearings about keeping their communities whole, the more likely they are to listen to these suggestions and keep the communities whole. But they have to hear from the community.
Yeah, that's a really important point because, quite often when we're telling people you can draw your own maps, people may feel a bit hesitant that I don't know how to draw maps, I don't know how to do that. But simply going to a Google Maps or getting a map of your community and drawing a circle, a square, a triangle, whatever it is, and saying this area needs to be kept together in one Senate district or kept together in one congressional district, or this makes up my community, and sending that a picture of that is your testimony. And it doesn't just have to be the president of the branch testifying about those different items. You need additional, like all of the members of your civic engagement committee or other organizations within your community to also testify to this point, just to make it really simple that you don't have to get as technical to take a class to learn how to draw a map, but you can literally take a picture or Google map and draw along the lines that way.
And so even for the person, that's correct. And even for the person that say to themselves, I'm not a visual person and I rather speak about it, map drawing could be done in words as well. When we're speaking to each other, we're saying, we think that our boundary, or we know that our boundary ends here, begins here. Here's where the northern border is. Here's where the southern border is. Here's where the eastern and western. So you can easily advise as to where your neighborhood or your boundary begin and end. And you can state why you feel that way, because we all shop on this particular strip, because all of our children attend the same schools. We attend this church service. We attend this
cultural political fair.
Yeah, exactly. We attend this political meeting. This is our home. And so no one can state that better than the person that lives there or worked there.
Now, there's a question here about Albany, about it being a federal civil rights district and gerrymandering that has happened in Albany. And I know you mentioned that Albany in our discussion before. Can you talk a bit more about that?
So that's the thing. So when we speak about how to draw a political map and the areas and boundaries that have been included or left out, it is very important that you do not, and this is why gerrymandering comes into play, that you do not do it according to race, that you do it according to communities of interest. At times, it comes down to that. It just so happens that most people of the same racial background live in this particular community or are hovered in this particular community, but it should not be drawn according to race. And so Albany is a town that will share district lines with other communities, and it will appear that it'll be about race, but you have to make sure that you have the 3 C's, right? Communities of interest, compactness. So it's very important and to look at the shape of what is drawn. If it appears that it mimics certain animals or certain body parts or certain features that you would not normally see on a particular map, then chances are it is gerrymandered. So you want it as close to a square or a circle as possible. And this is why we say that things have to be compact and it's contiguous. So there are times that the only thing connecting one community to another is a bridge or a parkway. And so you want to make sure that that's not the only thing that keeps a community together, but it's more, and you want to include as many of your institutions as possible in your community. And that's how you know that things are not quote unquote gerrymandered, because who uses these institutions more? And so you want to keep those principles in place.
Right. Well, I know we're running out of time, but Dr. Blair, I want to thank you so very much for making time this afternoon and also during the presentation. And we will be sharing with all of the branches your report that comes out this week, which is a detail of where people of African descent are in New York City specifically, and be sent to all New York City branches to be able to share. So thank you, Dr. Blair, for giving your time. And you can always reach out to me. And we can connect you with the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers, who is leading the redistricting project for people of African descent in the state of New York, in order to do office hours with Dr. Blair and your community on redistricting. So you can always reach out to me at president@brooklyn.naacp.org. I'll make sure to also put that in the chat. And we can coordinate a session specifically on your community. Thank you, Dr. Blair.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eljoy, I just want to let you know, you probably said Brooklyn about 15 times already.
I mean, because, you know, I don't know if you know this, but I'm from Brooklyn. No, I don't know if you know, just in case. I don't know. And also, I mean, this is a little known fact. I'm also president of the Brooklyn branch of the
Yes,
so you know, it comes out a little bit.
We had a new, instead of saying Brooklyn in the house, now Eljoy is saying Brooklyn in the Zoom.
Brooklyn in the Zoom. That's exactly right.
Well, we want to thank you always for your leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you.